Hi everyone, well thank you for inviting me to speak with you today about some new research I've been undertaking on Roman relief sculptures recovered from the Antonine Wall here in Scotland. Now that is the Roman Empire's most northwesterly frontier, and as the title suggests, my objective today is to take a rather non-traditional approach and I'll be flipping the script on colonial narratives that traditionally frame our discussions on these fascinating Roman reliefs. So our understanding of the Roman presence in Scotland is traditionally viewed, I would say, through a Roman lens, and that's influenced largely by fragmentary and heavily biased accounts of Roman authors and Roman material culture, and that includes monumental inscriptions that I here refer to as distant sculptures. Now, the aspects I'm exploring today are connected to a strand of the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project, which is a fantastic project that's connecting communities all along the length of this site, which is actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And they do that through various really innovative and exciting projects. But I'll also be decolonising the colonial language that is bound up within these objects. I'll be considering how museums shape our interpretations and they perpetuate colonial narratives in many ways. I'll also look at replicas as extended objects with their own composite biographies and as authentic objects worthy of curation and accession in museums in their own right. And I'll also consider replication through articulation before going on to flip that script and think about inspiration through emulation. So what are the distant sculptures that I'm referring to? Well, these are monumental inscriptions and they've been recovered from the vicinity of the Antonine Wall. And their historic and academic value is immense because they contain information on the Roman campaigns in Scotland that's not available to us from any other source. And they tell us about the legions who built the frontier, that's the 2nd, the 6th and the 20th legions. And we know that because of the text that's inscribed on these and other inscriptions from the wall. But crucially, they also record the distance of the frontier that each of these legions constructed. But actually they're inherently propagandist objects in their own right as well, and some of them actually incorporate iconography and they document aspects of the campaign or religious practice, for example, but they present that information to us only from the perspective of Rome. So they're really charismatic objects with power to polarise opinion, I would say, and they invite the viewer on an emotional and a tactile journey. So the first thing I think I really need to address is decolonising our language in reference to these things, and it's long been recognised in post-colonial studies that labelling Indigenous peoples that are in conflict with Rome as natives or barbarians has really quite derogatory and racist connotations. And I would say that such terminology is actually enmeshed as much in contemporary colonial attitudes as it is in the propagandist language that was employed by Roman historiographers who were promoting the might and the glory of Rome. And I'm going to suggest that actually similar caution really ought to be exercised in the language that we're applying to these monumental inscriptions today, because they've been historically referred to as Slavs. And I think that dismissive label has permeated, well, in fact, it has permeated scholarship for more than a century. And I would argue that it conjures a notion of really bland, uninspiring stone blocks that are bereft of any cultural or artistic significance. And I think the term Slav minimises their impact and meaning if we're going to consider the perspectives of people on all sides of the imperial divide, which I think is what we should be trying to do as archaeologists. So I'm uncomfortable with the term Slav, and I prefer to use that alternative terminology in reference to these quite magnificent things. And I'd further suggest the language we associate with the objects is particularly important in giving a voice to the previously silent Indigenous occupants of this region. So the Hunterian holds all but 2 of the distant sculptures that we know of, and I use their imagery here and not as any way as a means of singling them out for specific criticism at all, but only as an example for exploration to make the point that curatorial interventions actually and museum displays and museum spaces play a pivotal role in our contemporary engagement with these objects, and that's particularly in the articulation of the stories they tell and whose perspective is being in fact promoted or memories invoked in their narration. So paradigm shifts in the display of what was previously called ethnographic collections have actually moved quite far beyond this invoking of otherness that we used to see, and now they kind of embrace intercultural connections and entangled relationships, and they strip away these preconceptions of events distant in time and space, and often they talk rather than ethnographic collection, but nowadays often as world cultures. So I'm going to suggest that similar care really ought to be taken in the display and interpretation of archaeological collections, which have a tendency to favour these Roman perspectives still, and that language over others. So, but curated objects aren't the only way of exploring past events. In the absence of things, in fact, I would say exploring the perspective of subjugated peoples is equally powerful if the void that we're looking at can be embraced as a means of affirming their presence, if you like. So such culturally curated objects, I say, are ripe for reinterpretation and reshaping these colonial legacies and language that we have traditionally been exposed to. And our research into replicas is gaining real traction, and Dr. Sally Foster and Professor Shan Jones in Stirling, for example, have established a framework for dealing with replicas and recognising these as authentic objects that are worthy of study and curation as what they term extended objects, as part of, again, what they call composite biographies, and that links these replicas to originals. And we can even take that beyond biographies, I would suggest, and start to explore materialisms and object itineraries, which may be particularly relevant to replicas, I would say, because they collapse distinctions between the past, the present and the future, and they enable us to fully explore these object entanglements and networks as pivotal to their narratives. But replication is not a new thing, and antiquarians have been using replicas for germinating of new ideas, for example, research and teaching and exhibiting culturally significant material that would otherwise have remained completely inaccessible to many of the people that engaged with them. For museum audiences, this practice actually created whole new entangled connections between people and things, and that were collected from places that they haven't ever and probably will never visit. So replicas play a really pivotal role because they fold in echoes of a distant past, and they absorb new significance in their own right as authentic and valuable artefacts, and especially, I'd say, if they are standing in proxy for an original that no longer exists. So I've been tracking some replica distant sculptures in their trajectories, and this is a plaster cast of what is known as the Hutchison Hill sculpture, and it's currently on display in the Hunterian Museum as part of their Antonine Wall Rome's Final Frontier exhibit. Now, the original distant sculpture here was taken to Chicago by the US consul in 1871, where unfortunately it perished subsequently in the Great Fire. But fortunately, the Society of Newcastle of Antiquaries in Newcastle, Antonine, had the forethought to create some plaster cast before it was shipped out, and this one was presented to the Hunterian. Some of the details upon it were actually painted in 1979, and that's including highlighting the inscribed text in red, and some of the iconographic features are depicted in white. But 3 additional casts of this sculpture have been made, and they are now in collections of places like the Museum of Antiquities in Newcastle and Chester Museum, as well as Chester's Roman Fort. But there's a significance attached to this particular replica that I'll touch upon in a moment, but it's pivotal as an object because it's been woven through the Hunterian Museum's epigraphic story of the Roman presence here in Scotland, since it stands in proxy for a lost original. And if you've ever wondered what that Hutchison Hill sculpture looked like without the colour, here it is. It's a the one that is held by Chester's Roman Fort, that the curator there has been very kind to supply a photograph of. And if you dig a wee bit deeper, you may even find these fantastic and almost unknown wooden replicas of some of the distant sculptures that are hidden in the Glasgow Museum stores. So I'd like to now, if I may, return to the Bridgeness sculpture that I showed a glimpse of just a moment ago. And this is actually the largest and one of the best preserved distant sculptures from the Antonine Wall. It has a 3-panel format with a central inscription in familiar abbreviated Latin flanked by two graphic images set within architectural facades. Now on the right we have the Second Legion, who are actually the dedicators of this sculpture, participating in a sacrificial ceremony. And on the left we have a really brutal battle scene that's being enacted with a Roman cavalryman who is riding down and in fact decapitating northern warriors here. Now this is a really iconic image that epitomises colonial attitudes and propagandist practices that are commonly articulated on Roman, particularly frontier sculptures, as a means of really effectively reinforcing Rome's superiority and domination of a captured region, as well as the subjugation of indigenous peoples. And it's really effectively normalising that position and cautions Iron Age peoples against any forms of resistance, and effectively graphically reinforcing that resistance is futile, so don't even bother trying. And Bridgeness is also in fact the subject of most prolific replication, so we can explore some of these extensions as I mentioned earlier. And this is a plaster cast that some of you may be familiar with, and it's embedded into the Hunterian Museum centrepiece exhibit. It was cast in 1911 as part of an exhibit of Romano-British sculpture shown in a special exhibit in Rome. Now 165 casts were made of various sculptures, and I will come back to that point shortly. And it's not clear how many of these 165 casts were of Bridgeness, so we can't track the entire episode of this particular sculpture's replication. But importantly, like the Hutchison Hill example I showed you a moment ago, this cast is also woven into the Hunterian exhibit. And because it too stands in proxy, but this time is not in proxy of a lost thing, but of an original that is set into the wall, in fact, of the National Museum of Scotland in their Roman exhibit in Edinburgh. So in fact, I would argue that without this cast, the Hunterian's Roman story would in fact be entirely devoid of a beginning or an end, depending on your direction of travel through the exhibit. And yet this object hasn't been accessioned, and it doesn't have a museum number. Well, there is a number written onto it, but that's a different story for another day. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that unless you're physically engaging with this object on the museum floor, a researcher or an interested member of the public would be totally unaware of the replica's existence or its powerful presence as the largest and potentially the most impactful objects in the display, as well as its pivotal role in the narrative of the Roman presence in Scotland. So I've tracked down some other replica casts of the Bridgeness sculpture, and currently this one is on display in the Tullie House Museum Art Gallery in Carlisle. Here I have to address one aspect. Here it's a dichotomy from existing understanding of the trajectories of the Bridgeness replicas. This is another really informative aspect that's been revealed as a result of my own research, and during my investigations there were indications that this cast had been done for the inclusion in an exhibit that took place in the National Museum of Wales in the 1960s. Thereafter it was placed on long-term loan with the Museum of Antiquities in Newcastle before it was finally gifted to Newcastle in perpetuity in 2006. And I found that odd as a proposition because the original mould wasn't available, and I couldn't see the curators in the NMS permitting a new mould for this cast to be taken forward for that exhibit. And anyway, there doesn't seem to be a record of any such event. So I thought it much more likely that this was one of the group of casts of Roman sculptures from that Roman exhibit of Romano-British sculptures in 1911. I mentioned those 165 casts. So all of these casts were sold to museums and institutions across the UK and abroad. And I've mentioned a moment ago that the number of Bridgeness casts are not recorded, nor are the recipients. But I've done a little bit of digging in the archives in the National Museum of Wales. Curatorial staff have been very helpful. And they've confirmed that this replica was indeed one of those casts. So the work that I'm doing has already tracked down a significant previously unknown episode in the trajectory of that Bridgeness sculpture and its related replicas. And just as an aside, and something I found really interesting in Tullie House is that they use the descriptor distant stone, not the slab terminology that's favoured by many of my Scottish colleagues. So I'm just saying. Just showing you that there. You can see what I mean by the distant stone showing up there. This is another more recent replica. This time it's a machine drilled sandstone sculpture that's installed close to the original find spot of the Bridgeness sculpture in Bowness, and that happened in 2012. And this is a really interesting episode that my paper that I've recently published on this, if you're interested, explores, and it regards the repatriation of contested objects. And that's something we commonly associate more, I think, with objects in the ethnographic collections in the museum. And we don't really have time to delve into that today again. I'm very sorry about that, but it's an interesting thing to consider. Another interesting, if little known episode in the Bridgeness sculpture's replication is this commemorative stone. It's a plaque that's been built into a wall at the roadside close to where the sculpture was originally found, and it was donated to the National Museum of Scotland. So I thank the principal curator there, Fraser Hunter, for providing me with this image. It's not, I should say, a replica, as you'll see here, of the entire sculpture, but only of the actual inscription from the sculpture. This is a 2D scan that was captured by Historic Environment Scotland, and that was used for the machine drilled sandstone sculpture that we saw a moment ago, and that's been installed in Bowness. Below that we have a digital reconstruction of that iconic battle scene in authentic polychromy that I've used based on my own research using non-invasive techniques to identify the pigments that would have originally been applied to the sculpture surface. And I think it really nicely brings it to life. Spookily, coincidentally, last year the Royal Mail even replicated the Bridgeness sculpture, or a section of it. Note, I would say, that their continued use of the word slab in their caption, but we won't go into that. Perhaps more interestingly though, what they have also done is they've used that more settled, non-antagonistic image of religious practice on the right of the sculpture, and that's as opposed to the much better known battle scene that we saw on a moment ago on the left. And I'm wondering, is that because there's this growing recognition, especially in the context of Black Lives Matter and other movements more recently, that the image of the colonial invader trampling all over Indigenous peoples is inflammatory, and it perpetuates that notion of one group of people subjugating and brutalising effectively another. Now, earlier I mentioned one of the, in fact I don't think I did mention the Tombstone of Flavinus here from Wrexham Abbey. This is a really, again, iconic symbol of a Roman cavalryman who is riding down Indigenous warriors, and it kind of aligns with the image that we see on Bridgeness. But it's a very famous Tombstone of Flavinus. Iconography is not the only thing that's linking these reliefs from different frontiers, because this one's from Hadrian's Wall, because one of the casts of this object was also included in that National Museum of Wales exhibition I mentioned a moment ago in 1960, before it also was gifted to the Museum of Antiquities in Newcastle. But yet another cast of this tombstone exists in Corbridge. This time it was made from fiberglass and chicken wire on wooden struts. And it's not yet clear where this replica derives from, in fact, but it's understandably been quite challenging to get that information during some of the recent kind of disruptions that we've had. But it too was painted in vibrant colours in 2017 in an attempt to bring to life this scene for visitors to the museum's Hadrian's Cavalry exhibit. So I think, again, like my reconstruction, although that was digital, of the Bridgeness sculpture, this is a really nice way to help people to understand how the original objects would have looked. In an interesting twist of fate, it actually very briefly joined the original sculpture in Wrexham Abbey, where it was first excavated from, and when Corbridge was undergoing some refurbishment. And again, just another interesting episode of the original and its replicas' trajectories extrapolated across the ongoing entanglements that are folded into these objects. And for bonus points, there's yet another replica here, and this time it's again another wonderful 3D rendering of the object by Newcastle University's Digital Heritage team. But I'd suggest that actually if we're going to consider these things holistically and strip away these colonial narratives, we really have to try and unpack the relationships and events folded into them without privileging either people or things. And I'm going to try and cover some of these strands, but hopefully this graphic gives you a flavour of some of those entangled relationships I mentioned ago, including the additional layers of meaning that are folded into replicas and the people that are engaged with them in their active becoming, if you like. The list is potentially without end because, as we'll see in a moment, some of these replica sculptures actually moved into their new positions in a cultural landscape where they will now invite new audiences and tactile sensory engagements in a way that's just not possible in a traditional museum setting. So turning to these contemporary replicas, I'm consulting with a wonderful project, the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project. One of the primary outputs of that project is to replicate 4 sandstone replicas of the distance sculpture for installation close to the Antonine Wall, and those are in 4 of the local authority areas that the wall runs through. Now, this project is a collaboration between Historic Environment Scotland and the 5 local authorities through which that frontier runs. And it's funded by those partners as well as the National Lottery Heritage Fund and LEADER as well as other organisations. So the project was specifically developed to reach out to local communities and enable them to celebrate and discover the Antonine Walls in ways that are actually meaningful to them. So they're co-creators and co-curators, if you like, of the project being delivered, and one of these, as I say, is replicating the distance sculpture. Here we have a replication that took 3 stages. First was the competition by students at the City of Glasgow College who were asked to create 3D watertight images with colour overlaying onto them that can then thereafter lead into various digital platforms. So here we have the winning entry of that along with the project mascot, who is Maximus Minius, and he's standing guard over it. From these 3D prints, I think they were done to scale, so they are created and used by stone masonry apprentices to produce accurate depth and detail from which they can then carve the replicas. And I've been charting some of these from their inception through to their conception, articulation, and in time their installation. Now, I'm going to be tracking that further going forward and how different audiences engage with them. But it's critical, I think, from the outset to recognise the significance of these replicas and what we're doing here effectively is recording them for posterity. So replica production stimulates interest, we know, and active civic engagement with locally significant places and things and museums, and their value starts to come through as a result of collaboration with engaged communities and skilled artisans, and that's all part of the creative process of stimulating these new relationships and empowering connected communities with ownership of both the old and the new things. And so our main objective of the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project is to extend these audiences and start to create engagements, and they're working in partnership with the City of Glasgow College. And that provided a vehicle to inform young people, and that's a group that's traditionally quite hard to reach in heritage studies. So they were able to then understand a bit more about the wall, and we also were able to provide some unique training opportunities. And on top of that, 2 of the replicas that were in the roughing out stage during articulation here, below by the advanced craft stonemasonry students, what they're doing here is they're carving out these wonderful things and they're ready for installation into the landscape. They're now installed into that landscape. But I would say also that these are historically really important places in the landscape that can become exhibition spaces in their own right, where objects can be curated and new narratives about these old things can be explored. But critically, they also deliver accessibility to their connected communities who can then start to interact with them, and they're able to do that at any time of the day or night, and they're unhindered in that interaction by museum opening times, by no touching policies or restricted spaces, LED lights, or access to digital technologies that drive a lot of remote immersive content these days. So these newly created sculptures then start to absorb and project rich and diverse meanings to a multiplicity of people. and also places where they've got power effectively to create and nurture a network of invested collaborative partners and engaged new audiences. Now, we don't have time today to go through all of the replica distance sculptures, so I'm just going to very quickly go through, show you some images of some of these sculptures. This is the Arnabog sculpture. It is now set in place in a new position at Nethercroy near Croy Hill Fort in North Lanarkshire. And it's a really spectacular piece of work that is accessible to the local communities. And it sits beside a new wonderful sculpture of Flavinus, as he's been called after consultation, who's god of the woods. And this is a fantastic setting with beautiful views all around that the stone is now sitting in. Another one, we have a copy of a replica of the Easter Mains distance sculpture, which was recently installed at Twicker Healthy Living and Enterprise Centre in December, in fact, last year. It has some information panels that helps the local communities to engage with it and understand the stories better. So here we have the Summerson Farm distance sculpture, along with the sculptors of that, Josephine and Luke. Here is that Summerson Farm sculpture set into its new position in the rear of another result of the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project, which is another sculptor, this time of a centurion. We call him Centurion of the Stone. His name has been decided as Aurelius, and it's now set into the landscape at Lamhill Station stables, where the community are having a lot of fun engaging with it. And so local communities are encouraged to critically engage with these new sculptures and start to create, as I say, their own connections with it through stories that have yet to be told. And some of this will actually deviate, I'm sure, quite significantly from the narratives that have been imposed traditionally through museum displays. Another one that we have recently installed is the old Kilpatrick distance sculpture. Here it is in its new setting at Bascule Bridge in Old Kilpatrick, which is again another spectacular piece of art and sitting in a wonderfully open and available, accessible location near the canal. There has been a trail set up, and if you're ever interested, you can go onto the project's website, and there's a leaflet there that shows you how to get to each of these pieces, and you know, gives you a little bit of information of the background. So, coming back, if I can, to replicas, thinking about them as extended objects that I mentioned before, they possess their own itineraries worthy of investigation. There are other objects that draw influence directly from and are based upon replicating originals, but they develop newly conceived content, and I think these merit brief, if we must, consideration. And I think I would categorise these as in a connected category that I define as relational objects, insofar as they are entangled with and immersed in shared meanings and memories with an original artefact, but they deviate in really quite fundamental respects. And I'd argue that such objects are actually free from the burden of perpetuating a colonised history of originals that are not permitted to change in either the mindset of museum visitors or perhaps established scholars who have legacies, or museum curators where multiple narratives woven through exhibitions and digital content can, on some levels in fact, become quite reliant on unchanging histories. So originals can provide a stylistic framework for these relational objects, but as we'll see in a moment, newly created things actually leave participants with artistic license, if you like, to create new meanings and associations from different dimensions and alternative perspectives. And we can start to explore some of these aspects with a newly created release sculpture. So here we see the sculptures that I showed you a moment ago, Josephine Crossland and Luke Batchelor, and they're based in the Scottish borders, and they were commissioned to design and create a new fifth sculpture as part of the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project. And this effectively flips the narrative on the originals, and it follows that familiar three-panel format that we've already seen, with that central inscription flanked on either side by iconographic imagery. But there are three differences that are between these and the original distance sculptures. So firstly, apart from the date that's articulated in Roman numerals, the text itself is inscribed in English, and that makes, I think, the message much more accessible to contemporary audiences. And the inscription commemorates the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project, as well as the 21st Century Legion of Volunteers, and they played a pivotal role in its delivery. And secondly, the iconography takes inspiration from the sculptural style, technique and contents of the original, but it reverses that oppressive colonial imagery. This time it's juxtaposed and viewed through the lens of the local people who came into conflict with the military might of Rome. And thirdly, it considers contact and the potential for a more reciprocal interface between Romans and non-Roman occupants of the region, as opposed to that antagonistic, hostile theme that's articulated throughout the originals. So this is the final piece. It is a contemporary and actually quite a provocative piece of art, I would say, in its own right. It's depicting scenes that are quite subversive, and they are in conflict with the originals, and they're designed, in fact, to elicit an emotional response in the viewer, and it invites them to consider different dynamics and new dimensions from the contradictory perspective of local Iron Age peoples who clearly would have had a very different experience of events than the Roman military personnel that typically frames existing narratives. On the left, we have that iconic scene of battle that features now a new protagonist. This time it's a northern warrior who is charging into battle with a fallen Roman on a horse-drawn chariot, and he's roused by the melodic and haunting drone of the infamous Desford Carnix. On the right, we have a more settled scene though of a local couple who are interfacing with the Romans, featuring a ceramic jar filled with Roman coins. And that's in reference to the Falkirk cord, which also contained a fragment of tartan, which in fact is worn by the man in this scene, as well as on the clothing of the warrior on the left. And in the background, the astute amongst you would have noticed the formidable and uniquely Scottish architecture of a broch with grain sheaths depicting agricultural practice in the region. So I'd say in the act of becoming, this new object creates a sense of enchantment and performance really through the transformation of a plain stone slab into this new thing, possessing new properties and tangible meanings that contradict the stories told on the original stones. It invites intimate, tactile, emotional and sensory engagement through the sculptive narrative and the materiality of the stone itself. For example, there's a subtle red colour that is woven through the stone, and that lends itself, I would say, perfectly to the subject matter, because it, if you like, it emulates red pigments that would have been applied to the originals. And that actually creates, I would say, a dynamic and really very visually impactful effect of blood potentially seeping through the surface and permeating the stone to imbue it with that sense of realism, particularly on that left-hand battle scene. Now that's probably quite controversial as well, you know, because you could criticise that for flipping the narrative too far in the opposite direction and showing antagonism now from the Iron Age people. But this is a decision made by the local people who didn't want to see themselves as subjective, you know, and colonialised by Roman invaders. They wanted to be seen as fighting back. So that's something that the local community wanted to project through this imagery, and I'm sure it will elicit new stories and perspectives going forward. But again, going forward, these local communities will be encouraged to now critically engage with their new sculpture and create these new connections with it through stories yet to be told, some of which may very well deviate very significantly from the narratives told and imposed, if you like, through the originals. So that finished sculpture is now installed into a beautiful setting on the Cow Wynd close to Falkirk town centre. It's very easily accessible, and local communities are encouraged to, as I say, critically engage with their new artwork and create these new connections and tell new stories through it. And that, I think, will deviate very significantly from the narratives that have been traditionally imposed through traditional. So just finishing off, really, I'd like to just remind you of the polychromy on the Antonine Wall sculptures, in the imagery that I showed you earlier on the reconstruction of that scene of battle. And it's quite likely that, or quite possible, that one of the distant sculptures that's been replicated and now set into the landscape could be replicated in colour again, potentially digitally or physically. That's a decision for the people who are engaged with the sculpture to decide. But I just think it's a worthwhile kind of finishing point to start to consider these new dimensions and new perspectives and new ways for us to engage with these sculptures. And we can't, of course, do anything that will in any way harm or damage or amend or alter these originals, which are rightly curated in our museums. But the replicas permit us to start to think about these things in a different way and put them into new settings and new cultural contexts, as well as landscape settings, so that we can engage with them in a different way and try to flip that colonial narrative that is embedded into much of our own engagement with it. And think about the alternative dimensions that are embedded within them, and create new stories about them. Thank you so much.